Hello everybody and welcome to a brand new video! This is a special video and as such it will be a bit different from my regular style. Today we'll be tackling the scenario of what if Mineta wasn't a pervert. You know, a goofy episode for a foolish day. Just an FYI, the title mentions Mineta, but the story itself is more of an overview of the main story, only focusing on Great Boy when it needs to. Before we start, I quickly want to ask you to hit that like button and subscribe if you enjoy the video. You can also check out my Discord, link to that in the description below. Mineta is primarily a character meant for comedic relief, but he has a level of impact on the show's plot regardless. For this scenario, I will assume that Mineta would still have the motivation to be a hero in some form, mainly because of the society they live in. Since he's a pervert in this version, he'd get a higher score in the practical exam since he wouldn't get distracted by looking at girls, but he'd likely not even crack the top 10. He managed to get into the school in canon, so the same would be true here, just with a slightly higher score. We're ignoring the butterfly effect here, so the people to join the hero course would be the same. On his first day at school, little would change except he would likely take the quirk apprehension test more seriously, probably getting 1 or 2 ranks higher than in canon since his quirk is pretty versatile. The events there would stay the same, with Izuku placing last but showing his worth twice out in the process, so he would not get expelled. We do not know how the battle trial went exactly, at least for this team, so I'll just say Mineta and Yamomo managed to do a good job and win their match. The events of the USJ would generally go the same. The little exception would be that Mineta wouldn't annoy Tsuyu as much, so he would get placed gently onto the boat instead of tossed in. Since Mineta is still a crybaby, he would still throw his balls into the water after finding out that the villains were there to kill All Might, so Izuku would be prompted to develop the same strategy. They defeat the villains in the flood zone in the same way. Once they defeated those villains, they'd still head to the central plaza since Izuku wanted to investigate. Since they were talking to each other, they'd still be caught by Shigaraki and the events would end the same way as in canon. Mineta would likely take the sports festival training slightly more serious, but there'd be little change. He'd probably not think of hitching a ride on Yaomomo, so he'd end up not passing to the second round. Teams would vary slightly, but I think the results would be the same. In the end, Todoroki would fight Izuku and win that match, while Bakugo would secure the final victory of the festival. The hero names would likely not change, and neither would the events of the internships. Just because Mineta isn't a pervert doesn't mean he's considerate all of a sudden, so he wouldn't be able to help Ida out. He'd probably still go with a different internship than he did in canon. The final semester exams would arrive with little change. Instead of passing the exam as he did in canon, since he would lack extensive knowledge on Midnight, Mineta would end up failing the exam along with Zero. He'd probably run out of time or, ironically, end up on Midnight's lap. Izuku would still encounter Shiki at the mall, which would change the location of the camp. The trip itself would remain the same for the most part. The students would have to go through grueling training before reaching the camp. There they'd have a nice dinner and a pleasant time at the bath. Since Mineta never tried scaling the wall in this version, Izuku would never find out about Koda's backstory. He'd likely still be curious why he hates heroes, but would never be prompted to ask. As a result, he would never find out where Koda's hideout is. This is where the influence of the scenario would start being felt. On the third day of camp, the League of Villains Vanguard Action Squad would attack. This version of events would have Izuku having a teammate and Mineta being with those who failed the exam. It would likely end with Koda's death and Bakugo's capture just the same, while many more would be injured as I doubt Izuku would encounter Muscular. The students would likely have to muster their forces together to take him down. I could imagine Tokoyami in his berserker form being the one to take him down in the end. Since Bakugo would still be captured, the rescue mission would still go the same way as it did in canon, resulting in All Might's retirement. Because of All Might's retirement and what the students did, the dorms would be implemented, with many students still being on thin ice with the teachers. Still, they'd be moving forward, trying to get the students to develop heavily. Izuku, not having destroyed his arms as badly, would still be trying to imitate All Might too much. He would heavily feel the shackles in this version. He'd develop a couple of different special moves and likely still update his costume a bit, but nothing overly dramatic like in canon. Izuku being Izuku, I doubt he'd fail the provisional license exam. He'd likely pass the first part easily, employing many of the same strategies he did in canon. In the second part of the exams, I doubt his actions would differ too much. The battle between Izuku and Bakugo would still happen, as Bakugo needs a way to vent out his frustrations, and Izuku seems like the best option to do that. You know, he could see a therapist, but why bother when you have Izuku? Izuku would be pretty used to his fighting style here since he didn't go through a heavy change. He'd still push himself past his limit in the battle, but I don't think that he'd end the fight. Using the same fighting style would mean Bakugo would predict some of his moves more easily, so it would likely end in King Explosion Murder's victory. After his house arrest ended, Izuku would still have a similar interaction with Mirio, Gran Torino, and All Might, leading to him getting an interview with Night Eye. Even though he'd still fail his trial, he'd still get the work study since he is All Might's successor. On the first day on the job, Izuku would meet Eri and be set on the path to face the Yakuza. The raid would arrive a couple days later. Most of that would likely go the same as it did in canon. The heroes would slowly beat Overhaul's lackeys, advancing through the facility while Mirio kept Chizaki distracted. Eventually, Mirio would fall, but Izuku and Night Eye would smash into the room and relieve him just in time. Since Izuku's fighting style is a bit more developed, he might still pose a threat to Chizaki, but his more simplistic fighting style and tendency to copy All Might would either get him killed or cause him to break his bones and be killed by Chizaki as a result. This is a very likely outcome, but there is still a chance that Midoriya could hold his own long enough for people to intervene in the battle, at which point he'd get an Eri power-up and smash Chizaki into oblivion. Izuku would likely learn the same lesson from the battle as he did in canon, that being that he needs to develop long-ranged attacks. He'd talk to All Might about it and reach the same conclusions, which would end up in him asking the support course to help with some tech. Izuku having this added technology would make the gentle fight end in a similar manner. Sure, Izuku has a more simplistic fighting style, but against someone who rarely does battle, like Gentle, he'd likely still get the win. Once the Class 1A vs 1B practice matches arrived, most things in the exercises would just end up the same. Izuku would still manifest Black Whip, surprising both himself and most of his class. His group still has the superior power set, so they'd still win the match and secure victory for Class 1A. Since nothing would have changed with Choto's development in this version of events, he'd still invite both Izuku and Bakugo to intern with Endeavor. There, they'd polish their skills as they did in canon. At this point, Izuku might be advised to adopt a more complex fighting style, something like his shoot style in canon version of events, or maybe capoeira or something, I don't know. Or he might just focus on developing Black Whip and Air Force, learning to balance multiple things at once, which is what he focuses on in canon. Shigaraki's awakening would come soon enough, with most students developing until then. Like in canon, the heroes would stage a raid on the Metahuman Liberation Front's bases of operation. The situation near the hospital would escalate pretty badly once Shigaraki awakened. Izuku would still be a target because of One for All, so he'd end up in a direct confrontation with the story's main villain. If Izuku had developed a new fighting style, even if it were like shoot style, it would likely still be a bit clunky, which, even with all the assistance he had on the battlefield, it would end with Shigaraki trying to steal One for All. Shiga would still fail to do that, mainly because of their quirk works, but the damage he would take on would be far less than the regular version of events. So, fueled by his rage, Shigaraki would end up killing Izuku. If Midoriya didn't develop the new fighting style, he'd likely still end up being a bit slow or predictable, since even though he had the same fighting style as All Might, he lacked the power to pose a real threat. He'd likely end up dying as well. Dabi would still share his origins with the world, destroying the trust in hero society. This, combined with the loss of the future #1 hero, would end pretty badly for the hero society. In conclusion, although Mineta is a mostly disliked character by the fandom, he's still pretty integral to the story. If he weren't horny or if he weren't there at all, then Kota would have died at the hands of Muscular. weakening Izuku's development significantly, which would result in his death either against Overhaul or Shigaraki. Of course, I could be wrong. This is only one course of events that Continuity could take if Mineta weren't horny. Although most people do just ignore the problems in this stuff and just find a asshole fix around this, usually in what ifs. Yes. Well, if you enjoy this video, thank you so much for watching this silly video on the most foolish of occasions. If you happen to enjoy it, please consider leaving a like and subscribing. You might also want to check out the WTC The Anime Outcasts, link in the description. They do many cool what ifs, and one of the heads edited this video. Thanks, Fred! That's all from me for today. Hope y'all enjoyed. As never, until last time, no one, hello!